I talked about the environmental product in theory. Now let's look at two particular examples. Both are taken from the United Kingdom, and I'm going to look at work from the Office of National Statistics. And two different teams work on two accounts, the environmental accounts and the natural capital accounts. And the natural capital accounts are further developed. I'm going to start with the environmental accounts. So what do they contain? What do they not contain? Well, one of the things that they do not contain are emissions to water and to soil. It has a lot of data on emissions, but it's only to air. The environmental accounts of the UK are dominated by energy and carbon dioxide. Partly this is because a lot of data is available, but also that data is available because energy, and particularly carbon dioxide, have been a political priority. Of course, the ONS is supposedly neutral in all this. They should just collect all data, but they've taken a pragmatic approach that there is a lot of data available on these issues, so that is what we're reporting. There's also data on particulates and heavy metals. I'll show you one example of that. There's data on expenditure on environmental protection. There's data on the environmental tax revenue, and there are the material flow accounts. So this essentially gives you an idea of what is going on in part of the environment as it touches on the economy. There's absolutely no attempt to translate this into economic terms. There's no welfare, no valuation whatsoever in the environmental accounts. I'm going to show you 3 examples of what these things contain. Part examples of what the environmental accounts contain. There is much more. So let's look at the first example. This is vanadium, which is a heavy metal, and essentially what this table tells you is that in the year 1990, 32, I presume this is tons of vanadium were emitted by the economic sector called agriculture. And then that traces these emissions over time, and it looks at differences between sectors. And then of course you can add all these things up to total emissions. So if you're so this is the crude sectoral disaggregation, and then they do the same thing for the fine sectoral disaggregation, and then you go up to 100 sectors or so. So if you're interested in vanadium and you wonder where does this stuff come from, this table will give you the answer. And what you see is that vanadium is a metal that is used in alloys and that sort of stuff. So a lot of it comes out of manufacturing, a lot of it comes out of transport and storage, a lot of it comes out of power generation, and that is what an engineer or a chemist would also tell you. But here you have the hard numbers. This is where this stuff comes from. You may of course say, I've never heard of this stuff, why would I care? Well, vanadium is what makes things toxic. The salts of vanadium and the oxides of vanadium are toxic, so you should care about these things, this thing floating around in the environment. So that is one thing that the environmental accounts tell you. Where does stuff originate in the economy? And then of course it also gives you a hint. Suppose that you want to get rid of the stuff, where should you start? And if you want to get rid of vanadium, you should not target the real estate sector, because they don't contribute to the problem, or they hardly contribute to the problem. Right? So that is the first thing that the environmental accounts can tell you. And of course they do this for basically every heavy metal that there is, and for a lot of particulates and other things. Second thing that the environmental accounts tell you is who pays taxes on environmental issues. And again, it traces that over time, and again, it traces that by sector. And here you're looking at the total environmental tax bill, in 1997 and in the year 2016, and that's the intermediate years and somewhat earlier and somewhat later. This is just a comparison, and this tells you that in 2016 total environmental tax revenue was just shy of 50 billion pounds per year, so that's a sizable sum. And it also tells you that about a third of that came from households, and the rest came from different parts of the private sector. I should say of industry and services. If you compare that to the situation in 1997, actually more than half of environmental taxes were paid by households rather than by companies. So that is an important change over time. And if you compare the red bar here with the red bar here, this is what is paid for in environmental taxes by power generation, particularly. You see that the most rapid expansion of the environmental tax burden fell on this particular sector. So this is useful information. You can use this to argue that there's been an enormous tax inflation here. Perhaps we should stop it. You could also say, well, this is the current tax burden. How does that compare to, say, estimates of the Pigouvian tax burden? How much taxes should be paid? You can compare that to how much taxes are paid. So this is again useful information. The environmental accounts also contain the so-called material flows account, which is essentially an input-output table, but now in tons of stuff. Not measured in money, it is measured in tons. So if you look at biomass, and what this table tells you that in 1992, 46,000 tons of biomass were subtracted from the environment, extracted from the environment in the forms of crops. So this is the useful stuff that farms generate, and another 102,000 tons were subtracted in the form of residues, as well as fodder crops and so on and so forth. And you can track how that changes over time. So this is just pure the amount of stuff. The same for metal ores, iron and non-iron that was extracted from the ground, and limestone and clay and sand and gravel, and all these things are given. So this is domestic extraction. Then there's also the stuff that was imported. If you look at iron ores, this is 25,000 tons compared to 31 tons domestic production. Most of the iron that we use is imported. So, of course, I also jumped in time here. But if we made a comparison for 1992, it would be very, very similar. Most of the iron is imported and has been since a very long time. So if you just want to know how does stuff flow through the economy, this would give you an idea. So this is imports, and then they also have the exports of these materials. So just want to know how do things flow through the economy. The environmental accounts will also give you an idea. But the important thing to keep in mind here is that these are just tons of material. These are not economic numbers. These are physical numbers. And in that sense, the environmental accounts are not particularly well developed. The natural capital accounts, developed by a different team in the ONS, is much closer to theory. And essentially what they try to measure there is the annual value of the services provided by nature, by the natural environment, for three things: provisioning, regulating, and culture. And I'll show you examples of all three. I won't take you through every table that they have, The provisioning services are stuff that feed us and keep us warm, such as agriculture and timber and those sort of things. The regulating services are sequestration of carbon or the pollution, the removal of air pollution. Cultural services are recreation, and in their accounting a bit peculiar, house prices are included there as well. So let's look at an example of provisioning. This is essentially the value of the stuff that we extract from nature. Time series and then a sectoral decomposition. And in the past, the red dominated that highest value, the most value from just extracting things from nature were fossil fuels. And this is essentially the oil in the North Sea. Highly valuable, but then later on prices collapsed and extraction fell, production fell as well. And now fossil fuels are a much smaller component, and in 2016 they were a tiny component because prices were so low. And water extraction was actually one of the bigger ones. Water is very valuable, and we use a lot of it. And agricultural biomass was another major issue for the Brexiteers. Fish capture is in orange, and if you look very closely you can occasionally see some fish in here, but it's just a tiny part of the economy. Even if you just restrict the economy to resource extraction, then still fisheries are just not important, regardless of what a Brexiteer may tell you. So that is one thing that the natural capital accounts tell you, and as you see, it's figure 2, but there's other figures there as well. Now let's move forward to one of the regulating services and look at the removal of particulate matter. And this is a very fine particulate matter, 2.5 microns or less. Oh no. This is a very fine particulate matter, but the graph also shows you the coarser ones, and then SO2 and ammonium and nitrous dioxide. So what does this graph tell you? It essentially tells you we emitted these things, where do they disappear in the environment? And what this graph tells you is that if you're worried about PM10, actually most of it is absorbed in forests or open woodlands. This is enclosed woodland. Not so much is removed in so-called woodlands. This is enclosed farmland, not enclosed woodlands. If you're worried about ammonium, then actually most of it is removed by farms. And that also tells you, if you're worried about these things, what are the healthier places, what are the not so healthier places. And it tells you something about if you have a particular environmental problem, then this is the type of landscape that actually deals with these problems. And of course, you would also have chemical and biological studies that would tell you the same thing, that trees actually absorb a lot of environmental pollutants and are not just nice to look at, not just provide oxygen, but also do a lot of good in making the air cleaner. This just confirms that and gives you a total for the UK. So these are useful things to know. Of course, this is a service. The recreation or the cultural services, what you're looking at, it's given in this graph here. This tells you not an economic indicator, but just when Brits are outdoors, where are they? Well, most people live in cities, so a good chunk of our outdoors time is actually still spent in cities. Then we all like to go to the beach, that's the orange. Forests are pretty popular too, so this just tells you where do people spend their time. And then they also have numbers on what is actually the value of this, and this just follows from a travel cost survey. And the exact values of spending time on the beach versus spending time in a city are different, and that explains the difference between the difference in appearance between the hours spent and the value attached to it. So this gives you some indication of where to we enjoy ourselves. And also it actually gives you, it's actually pretty valuable, £8 billion. Now, I obviously did not take you through everything. This is figure 34. There's reams and reams and reams of data, but it gives you an idea of what national statistical offices around the rich world are doing in order to make the environment visible in their accounts, just as the economic accounts make what is going on in the economy visible.